morning. Please turn with me. Thank you. Sometimes I should wait, huh? And actually expect a reply. But sometimes you get in the habits and I'm just like, hurry up because in case nobody says anything, but thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully for the last time, as the brother read, the heavens and other things will wear out. And I feel like I've worn out these 7 chapters of the Psalms, but good news. This marks the point at which we begin to speed up in our journey through the rest of the Bible. And if you will allow me to sum up some of the things that we talked about in Psalms 99 through 105, then we can move on. And hopefully the title Ambition can help you understand why. For whatever reason, that lead-in question I had to one of the small group questionnaires. Have you ever had any experiences with side effects? Well, that'll hopefully make a little bit more sense now. Why? Because one of the things that I'd say, if I had to go back to my list of personal regrets, one of the things I regret most is kind of those times in life when I have lived the flip side of what the Bible notices about Noah after he got off of the ark. And it talks about Noah did all that God had asked him to do. And one of the things that competes with the times when I would like to ideally say I'm doing all that God has called me to do is my ambition. And the times in which I had something I wanted to get done, and as we talked about in the young adult class, it tends to water down my ability to hear what God has actually called me to do. Think about it from this perspective. If you were going to pay good money to go get counsel, whether it's counsel just for some issues you got going on. We all need some kind of counsel. I think he's called Wonderful Counselor, right? And so sometimes you get it from the Word. Sometimes you need some additional help from people who actually know the Word and what the Word or the wisdom that God has given us apart from the Word has to offer. So sometimes, like I say, when those two mix, my job is easy because the sciences and the Bible are saying the same thing. And so if you find a great counselor and you give them good money to tell you what to do. It's one thing if they're giving you a mix of good advice and bad advice. But if their advice is spot on, 100% on this particular day, and you walk out of that office and do half of what they've counseled you to do, then you have now watered down the excellent counsel you paid great money to get. And so when Noah's coming off of the ark, and the author takes pains to help us understand that at this period in his life, he did all that God commanded him to do. He's not simply trying to be a good soldier. We're understanding that in this part of his life, the reason why he was able to get himself and 8 souls through that very tumultuous time, the deluge, is because he had done all that God had counseled him to do. And how do we know that matters? Well, after he gets off of the boat, he doesn't always do what God had called him to do. And who can blame him? Why? Because the pressures of life get to the point where all my best Sunday morals will get compromised. When I get out into what Paul describes as run this race real fast, run with endurance, right? Because it's going to bring you to some places they call it deep water, where you're not always as good in, if we use allow me a sports metaphor, round 1 of a fight as you are in round 5. And that's one of the reasons, or one of the things that separates me, average Joe, from people who train to fight for a living. I might be able to just rely on muscle memory for a couple of rounds. But when I get out in the deep water, then we're going to really see how I start to swim. So please don't blame Noah when the stress of all that he had been through leading up. Understand, he had to go through the drama of being isolated during the building of the ark. Why? Everybody was patting him on the back. Go, Noah. No. He was considered weird for even building an ark in the first place. That's stress. And then he's on the ark and he knew, okay, this is when we're going to get out. No. He was throwing out, pigeons and doves trying to figure out, when do I get off of this thing? Because I'm guessing life on the ark wasn't as good as it was. And so over time, God got him through all of that. But once the pressure was off, I'm thinking he still had some of that weight on him. And eventually, that's what led to the vineyard moment, where everything that had survived the ark was now tested to see how are you going to respond to life after the ark. And so the things that got them through the flood were going to be just as important. But understand, I say it from time to time, The times when I regret my decisions the most are the ones that I've made in my times of privilege, times when things were going well. It's easy enough to refer to David. I'll just stick there. We know what life was like when David was in the wilderness. Strong soldier, always calling on God. Which way should I go? What should I do? But it was in those moments of peace when everybody was like, you've had enough on your plate, David. Take a break. We say you got to be careful to understand all that God wants for us during the downtime too. Because even Christ himself, when he overcame in the wilderness for that 40 days and 40 nights, one of the translations of Satan's response to that was, oh, he just left. I got other things I can do. There's only one Jesus. The rest of them are weak. That's why he calls them sheep. It says he left him for an opportune time. He wasn't done with Jesus either. And so understand, even when God has gotten us through some things, if he's bold enough to come back and mess with Christ again, got to get your expectations in the right place. He's coming back. And so that's one of the reasons why that whole concept of all is so important, because it's the downtime when I often forget I need all just as much when my ambitions are kicking in as when I was struggling and I knew I needed to do all he was counseling me to do. Verses 8 and 9 are maybe a reminder of some things we talked about from Psalm 99. O Lord our God, you answered them, you were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoings. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. And one of the ways I can be tempted to water God down, as we said, it's one thing for me to worship God. We talk about praise and worship all the time. It's a huge industry. People make a lot of money off of what they call praise and worship. It's music, right? We love music. But if I'm not exalting or singing praises to the God that actually is, I am watering down the effect of those psalms. Thank you, brother, for the psalms, right? Because one of the reasons why we pull psalms out of a hymnal is some of those principles they're tried and true, right? And even if they stray in certain ways, we can talk about that. But as we grow, there's some great songs that are being written, but they're not always being written to, in my belief, the God of the Bible. And so we do well to realize that to the degree we are singing songs that we hear on the radio that aren't giving us a true representation of who God is, that is one of the ways the enemy can be convincing us to water down the counsel of God. And so one of those side effects is, to the degree I'm singing, fired up, song might be hitting me right where I'm at emotionally, but might not be guiding me to a place where scripturally I understand that this is truly what God is counseling me to do. I'm getting an emotional bump, but I'm not getting an emotional solution. And I'll help you out. The difference between an emotional bump and an emotional solution is it's that momentary high I get when that problem is fixed quick, but at the same time, I got to go back again to an illustration I used when I was a youth minister. We set a big crate out in front of the class, and we would have footballs. We would have all kinds of things from school that the kids were used to doing, whether it was books, activities, or whatever. I'd say, pick one up, tell me about it, upside and downside, kind of like the study guide is designed today. And after everybody got through talking about the things they loved most about that one activity, that one thing that represented what they did, they filled up that container. And after everybody was done sharing, I was like, is it full? They're like, yeah, it's full. I was like, it's kind of like your lives, right? Feels like it's full. You're busy, running from one thing to another. Doesn't feel like you have time to do anything else. However, if I took a big old pail of sand, I'm stealing an illustration from anybody who's heard this one before, and you poured sand in all that stuff, would you think it was really as full as it was when you had all that stuff overflowing through the top? No. Why? Because the sand fills in the cracks. And understand, that's a metaphor for why even in my busiest times, I can still feel emotionally empty. Because I might be dragged here and dragged there. And when I have a time to just take a break, it's just a break. Because eventually, wait a minute, there's still something that's missing. And it is when God pours the sand into my container that I realize all I've been doing is putting a bump in all my activities over the fact that I still got some things that I haven't completely worked through. And so that's one of the things that we all share in common. Why? Because if you got the opportunity to have any time, then you got ways to fill it. But then you also know what it's like once those activities are over to still wonder what's going on, right? And so the beauty in what God is giving us is the answer to all these. I'm going to give you a quick answer. All these, what's the upside? Stability. And that's the verse that our brother read. God has a wisdom that offers us solutions that give us a stability that my mix of me and God will never provide, because I only see in part. We talked about it in I did. No, I'm just No worries. I got the opposite problem. See, my phone is always on Do Not Disturb, and so when people are trying to get in touch with me, please don't yell at me, Brother Joe. Then, right, I forget that I have it automatically set to Do Not Disturb. So don't worry. But as we were talking about in the young adults class, when Paul used the mirror metaphor, saying, "Now I see in a mirror," as in a mirror dimly, he was looking. Most people will tell you at what they had for mirrors at the time. They didn't give you a great reflection as what we can have now in mirrors that we see. And so he was simply seeing partially. And Paul was an apostle, and he only understood, as we've said before, only so much of what was going on in his own struggles. And so understand, part of the reason why we have to have faith in God is a very practical reason. It's just like we can't run, as soon as our problems start, we want to get a counselor. Like, I could go to Google and try to figure out what they're going to tell me, but they've been to school for a while for a reason. And God willing, between their education and their experience, and God willing, the fact that they care about what I'm going through, they have some things that I can't replicate, which is why I'm paying them in the first place. And so understand the Apostle Paul, even the wisest of the apostles, he realizes that if I'm going to God but I'm watering down his instructions, what does it really mean? And so that's the whole point of understanding. I need, whether it's music, whatever the activity is, whatever the thing is that I'm using to fill that void, I need to make sure that I'm getting the pure impact of what God is saying. This is where healing actually is. And so as we go on to Psalm 100, it's going to talk about a couple of things in verses 3 and 4. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. The two things that stood out to me from there were in verse 3, yes, the whole concept of we are sheep, and we have to understand part of that concept of sheep is being able to be easily led. Some people call it being teachable. The other part is gratitude. I think you understand the whole concept of when you do something kind for a person, you get to a place of emotional maturity where you say, I don't need thanks for that. But you get there because you know what it's like to be nice to people and not get a thank you, and to have to overcome the pain of ingratitude. And so God is telling us as spiritually mature Christians, we have to understand we have to mature to the point where we can do thankless work effectively and not give up, but not lose our inclination to be grateful. And here's the thing. It seems like it's a double standard. It is. But it's a double standard like all the ones we have woven through life that help us to grow and really realize that there is this ideal. That's what's in our heart. That's what makes us hope for heaven, right? But we function in a world where we have to, if we're going to lead anything other than a miserable existence, we have to maintain that hope of heaven. I think I heard Jesus say somewhere, unless you accept the kingdom like a little child, the expectation and the hope that little children have for things that make their eyes light up when we just kind of are kind of sleepy, right? We should try to maintain that hope of heaven. But that reality, that one of the reasons that some of those ambitions the children have make us sleepy is because we know what it's like for life to kind of just grate that out of us in terms of reality. And so we have to learn to function in the reality of life without becoming so jaded that we lose the enthusiasm that, God willing, heaven can help use to refill our tank and inspire us to keep moving forward. But here's the catch. The downside of that is if I'm watering down my allegiance, if I'm super teachable to Marcus, Marcus, I listen to everything Marcus says, and I've already told you that's not a good idea. Right, Cody? Just checking. Because in one of the small groups, every time Marcus makes a mistake on one of these here, Cody gets blamed for it. Because Cody should have proofread that. Even though he didn't get it till about 5 minutes before I get here, right? And so you don't want to read from the book of Marcus because it gets pretty redundant. That's one of the lessons that's coming out. But that's one of the things I learned that makes me a little bit more comforted in my own redundance. I try to create repetition that actually breeds progress, meaning it's a foundation for growth, not simply redundance. Why? Because I won't say started falling apart. I was super disappointed with all my favorite teachers. I was like, that guy was boring today. I was like, what in the world, right? But that's human nature. And it happened to me enough that I was like, okay, well, maybe I can pick myself up and keep going too, right? But that's how we're built. And the real wisdom, the sign when you see wisdom increasing and growing and increasing, it's going to come with some mistakes. There's going to be some of that mixed in there because we're still flesh, we're still human. But the wisdom that endures, the red flag for that, or maybe a green flag, that's coming from God. And so that's one of the reasons why when I flop, heard some comedians talk about dry mouth bombing. That kind of bombing you do when you're up in front of people and it's going so bad you just want to drink of water even though you're not thirsty. But it's just all falling apart. There's a blessing in that too. Why? It tells me I need to draw closer to God willing to say some things that he would have us understand. Why? Because the cult of Marcus would get real dry after a while. All you'd have to do was follow me for very long to realize how uninspiring it really is. And that's one of the things we've talked about before. One of the advantages of being able to close the gap between my personality and my character is ultimately over time I become more comfortable with you being able to see me as I actually am. And I'm upfront about the fact that you don't want to follow me. You want to follow me. How did Paul say it? Imitate me, Paul. No. Imitate me as I imitate him. And in that way, it's healthy for us to all imitate one another, right? Because God has made it easier for us individually and tougher in some areas to do different things. And so in places where Brother Randy is giving us a better picture of God, I can happily follow Brother Randy and the picture of God that he is giving me, right? And when other brothers are giving me strong indications, Brother Tom, Sister Renee, of things, I got to start finding other people to pick on y'all, I'm sorry. But it's everyone, really. To the degree that we are actually representing the things that God is doing, there's going to be some area I don't do that as well. And I can look to you as an example. And then vice versa, God willing, that piece of God that hopefully I am representing, you're comfortable saying, okay, I see that. But it all goes back to being measured. What's the measurement? Verse 5, for the Lord is good. That's it. That's it. See, ultimately, I don't know who is good apart from God. Every other image that I can get of what is good or bad is a watered down image of goodness if I am not closely measuring the person I see to the character I see of Christ, right? And so that's that measurement that helps me avoid the wasted time for pouring years of my life to the love and the devotion to flawed heroes. Do you know what that's like? Yeah, I think we all know what that's like, right? And so for that reason, one of the best bosses I ever had told me, someone might have told some of you, he's like, you under-promise and over-deliver to the best you can in your life. And by maintaining or managing expectations in a healthy place, you're not only helping your consumer, the people you work with, whatever, have reasonable expectations for you, but at the same time, you're working on your own humility to realize that I might be able to do this, but let me just give a more accurate appraisal of what I actually can do so that we're all on the same page about who I actually am and what we actually can accomplish together. And so understand that a lot of this came from illustration I'm kind of scared to use, but me and Mom were watching true crime shows yesterday. True crime shows, and one of them led us to caught my attention because I was about to go to my room. I don't want to watch any more true crime, but I saw Highway 90 on the intro. I was like, oh, wait a minute. So there was this true crime episode that had to do with this guy who started out in Montana, made his way to Tacoma, and eventually ended up in a very tragic shootout with law enforcement. I can't remember where it was, but he made his way down to California. He got in a whole lot of trouble along the way. Burned through 2 marriages. He was on his 3rd by the time. He had convinced one of his sons to shoot it out with the cops. And one of the things that ended up saving the children that he had from these different marriages that did not end up dying with him or in prison behind his antics was the fact that The moms understood how to cut their losses and make sure that as much as they could, they had to be able to get the kids away. And that was the bright line in this family. That's not, don't get me twisted. Mark is not talking about the glories and joys of divorce. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, because we have folks who understand what God says about that is true. But understanding in this circumstance, the point at which we have to understand the best way that we can move forward. Because what happened in this situation was these kids who were very loyal to their dad, when they started shooting it out with the cops, they survived the first one. They survived the first one because it happened twice. And what happened was dad threw the son who did most of the shooting, he threw him under the bus. He was like, he did it. And we're like, really? No, what happened was they were following your lead, bud. This is what you were training them to do. And the sad part is, one of the kids who made it, he ended up going to the military to do a tour in, I think, Iraq or Afghanistan. He ended up taking the things that his father had taught him and taking them in a healthy direction because mom got him out in the right amount of time. But the ones who stayed too long ended up taking all that training and shooting it out with, like we said, law enforcement. And so now he loses one son to prison as he does his time and he gets out. He's free to roam, but he's still got one son left, and he's not done. And so he goes to find that son, and he gets really upset one night, and all the things that he'd been gassing his son up, they pour a few drinks in, and now they're off to look for an officer this time. And they actually find the officer this time, right? And they set up a trap, and they actually get that officer. The good thing is they were not able to get as many law enforcement officers as they were planning to get. But understand the same thing happens again. For whatever reason, dad lives through it, while son ends up in a coma and eventually passes on, right? And when they're putting together his defense, who do you think got blamed for the shooting? The son. And there's a certain point at which you have to say, what we're looking at here in Psalm 100 is you have to be very careful at how you define good and bad. Because the Bible is helping you understand, if you are measuring character, that your definition of what is good and what is bad needs to be constantly measured against the warnings that God has given us. Otherwise, your discernment is watered down. And ultimately, what happens is when you have enough experiences of having relationships break down, enough experiences of having them fall apart, then what happens is you start to realize that some of the people who are best at, not just relationships just fall apart because we all had the best of intentions and it just didn't work out. But there are people what the Bible describes as wolves in, say it with me please. Exactly. That's in the church. It's not just in the church. It's outside, because ultimately that's another place where the sciences and the Bible line up. One of the things we have to navigate in this life, in this time, is it's not always people who are just well-intended who are asking us how we're doing. Sometimes we are being approached by people who see us in a time of need, and they want to find out all they can about us because they can potentially use that emotional need to bring us into a bond that will cause us to dismiss every red flag that mom, dad, friends, and God himself would tell us we need to be very careful of. And so one of the things that is so important about understanding God's wisdom is he is helping us understand that in our times of emotional vulnerability, we can step into a mess that we don't even see coming. And so when we're talking about this tragic situation with this family, where two of the sons, all of the sons from one mother, one either ended up in prison or dead, and his father who moved on, he's in prison, but he was spared the death penalty by some technicality. Ultimately what happened was, it wasn't until he actually pointed the finger at them that they realized what he was really about. And so what God is trying to do for us is he's trying to help us understand something that we'll see in the next psalm as well. When we talk about Psalm 101, a psalm of David, verse 8, morning by morning, I will destroy all the wicked in the land, cutting off all the evildoers from the city of the Lord. That sounds like a great ideal, right? But one of the brothers pulled me aside after that lesson. He's not here today. One of the brothers pulled me aside. He's like, Marcus, David wrote that psalm, but that's not what David did when it came to Absalom. Oh, wait a minute. And that exception that David carved out between his ideals, the things, the good common sense he knew he was getting from God, and that emotional space that Absalom knew he could occupy was the difference between David's house going on an upward trend and that huge dip where he didn't necessarily know how long he was going to be king or if he was ever going to be king again. And so one of the things we get in terms of the way of wisdom from God is he helps us get it out of our mind that there is some mix of righteousness and unrighteousness that I can put together and still have it become righteous, right? And here's the other thing that happens. I'm a whole lot more okay with unrighteousness when I think it's hurting. I don't even want to point at nobody. But it's true. It just doesn't hit me the same when it's not hurting me. And so I have a higher tolerance for it, even though I don't see, just like David found out the hard way. I really got to stick to that ideal. And even if it's in my own house, we might not need to break out the gallows, but I got to do something. Otherwise, Absalom's going to take matters into his own hands. And those are the things that I don't see in my life. So the times when I regret most, my ambition, I just want to keep the peace by just pretending it's just gonna go away, right? Sometimes that's true because there are times, I remember a wiser youth minister told me, Marcus, do not preach to a problem that cupcakes can fix. Why is that true? Because there's some problems you can fix over just coffee or whatever your favorite. Look, one of the advantages to knowing people really well, it's not the wolves in sheep's clothing thing. When you know people relatively well, then you understand the things that might actually help them get to a place of peace and comfort that don't have to be over-preached or over-talked to. Sometimes it's the simple things that can simply put a person on pause emotionally long enough for them to basically hear from God, who is the one who's really going to be able to heal in the first place, right? But to the degree it does take words. Understand that there are some things that God is helping us understand. These are things you really need to deal with, bud. And these are things that cupcakes, get cupcakes, right? And so that's the discernment in God's wisdom. He helps me understand cupcake problems from problems. And so I can't understand it on my own. Why? Because I'm going to crave peace in certain circumstances where I just want to turn my back and just be like, no. And God's like, no, that's not necessarily a safe place to do that. Why? We talked about a little bit Nathan. When Nathan was sent to David to rebuke him about Bathsheba. The good thing about that is they got through that, like we talked about. But then when David wanted to build the temple, they'd been on such a hot streak, then Nathan's like, do whatever you want, God's with you. And God came to him that night and said, no, I'm not. No, I am not. And that's the wisdom we get from God. And that's where that whole concept of making sure that my ambitions are underneath his, and in line with his, helps me distinguish those times when, like we said, the problem really is a cupcake problem, and I don't need to overtalk it. But then there are times when I might be bringing cupcakes to a time when we really need an intervention. Going on, Psalm 102. If you look at verse 17, he regards the prayer of the destitute and does not despise their prayer. We talked about that before, and one of the side effects, positive on the upside, of me having a good idea of what it is that God is doing is I don't have to waste my time in vain prayers. We talked about setting healthy expectations. Praying for things that God's just not, I was never interested in that, bud. If you've ever been in a situation where there are times when I get in a mode where I want something so bad that I am talking past what I know the level of interest of the folks I'm talking to might be, right? But there are times it's like going into a job interview. Be one thing for me to go in and I want to go work on the stock market, but all I'm doing is preaching to them about Jesus. There's a time and place for prayer, right? I don't need to get my hopes up in that situation. Does that mean I'm selling Jesus out? No, I just know my audience. I know the proper venue, I know the time, and I know the place, and that's the wisdom that God gives me. He can allow me to retain my integrity as a believer, but go into different environments and understand the right way to speak to people. Paul, I became all things to all people. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he was so closely not only in line with understanding the word, but understanding the places where the word wasn't immediately giving him the answer of how should I be in this situation. When Nehemiah went before the king to ask permission to leave, to go back to Israel, understand that was a time when they had already messed up some of the king's money. And so they were basically saying, look, king, we're going to need a little bit more time. We're going to need a little bit more of that. Yeah, right? And so that's a hard one. That's a hard question to go ask your boss if you know you've already kind of burned through some things, and he wasn't necessarily, you didn't owe you in the first place. But that's what Nehemiah was doing. And before Nehemiah went into the king to have that conversation, he just took a quick pause. Somebody helped me understand one time, like, God be with me. And sometimes, as much as Nehemiah, he was esteemed. He was a high official. They didn't just send anyone. Nehemiah had risen to a high position, and he risked his position to go help get Israel a second chance at going home. And he understood that no matter how much clout I have with the king, I gotta have the king be eager to give me a second chance. And I need God to open his ears and his heart to help me get that second chance. And so it's the discernment that God gives us to help understand what kinds of things is God actually interested in hearing about. I think it would have been a whole lot different if Israel or Nehemiah had spent the first portion of the money on partying, as opposed to them actually making honest mistakes about the way in which they did not properly resettle Israel the first time. And so understand, God is full of grace and mercy. It goes back to Psalm 99. Psalm 99, we talked about in verse 6, I skipped over that this time. Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel also was among those who called upon his name. They called to the Lord, and he answered them. But, as we said in verse 8, but he was an avenger of their wrongdoing. He wasn't simply there trying to remind them of everything they had ever done wrong. He was willing to forgive them. And that's the beauty of understanding the situations in which God is willing to forgive. There are going to be some times when I have spent the money on partying. I went to college. Y'all are doing college a whole lot better than I did. But God gave me a chance to come back from that too, right? And so it's not always the great ways we misuse the money. Well intentioned. There's some times when I had poorly intentioned uses for the resources that God and the family had poured into me. And God gave me another chance. That's what we're talking about here. It's not, as we said before, perfect servants. And so verse 17 of Psalm 102 reminds us that he regards the prayers of the destitute. And we said the whole concept of destitute wasn't just money in that term. It is those who, no matter where you spent the money, no matter what the cause is, you are now free from the need to try to justify what you did to God. And that is the time in which my regrets began to stop. The time in which I was destitute of defenses. They weren't really defenses. They were just what I could kind of come up with in a time when I felt like I was on the spot, right? When I began to honestly talk to God, because he sees through anyway, that is when he began, or at least this psalm talks about, that's when you can begin to believe confidently that he's answering your prayer in a life where you might not always feel like he's talking to you or hearing when you talk to him. He's saying this is one of the times when you can expect that, when you drop the excuses, the blinders, and everything else, and just talk to him sincerely. Chapter 103. We look at verses 17 and 18 and maybe 20. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children, to those who keep his covenant and do his commandments. Verse 20, bless the Lord, O you his angels, you mighty ones who do his word, obeying the voice of his word. And there we talked about this whole concept of, we didn't talk about, there's another one that illustration I probably left out and really thought about later as I was prepping this week. But I do talk about from time to time, when I was in that time in my life when I was looking forward to what I was going to do or what I was going to be. I would go into, I don't know if they still call them guidance counselors, people who help you understand how you're going to align what you're doing or what you're studying with what you actually want to do. And here's the more important thing, whether or not you'll actually be happy in that in another 5 years, because that's another dilemma I think I've told you about. About half of my friends, once we got out of school, within 5 years, none of us, or half of us, weren't doing what we had gone to school for and put a lot of time and money into. And here's the thing, I think I've also mentioned what life was like for me during the pandemic, coming back as a preacher, not connected to a congregation. No plan. Tried to plan a little bit, but my plans, they weren't necessarily his. And I see the wisdom in him putting me back in the job market for about a year before I went back to preaching, because I didn't think I'd been out for very long. I was about out of the job market for 10 years, and things had changed a whole lot. See, for me, it was just, a few years as a youth minister, a few years as a missionary. No, things had changed. And so when I went back into the job market, I had a little bit more wisdom, a lot more wisdom than I would have had if I had to talk to people who were working a 9-to-5 life or whatever hours you're on and struggling with the realities of this job market. And so part of the pandemic, I think I've said it before, I was out in the street corner with a sign and was preaching Jesus on the street corner, like them crazy street preachers. I was him. I always wanted to be one too. God gave me the chance, right? Question is, are you gonna do it? Got out and street preached for a while, and the thing I started to realize was, hold on, sorry, my memory's really bad. Oh yeah, that's it. Is that you're never unemployed when you understand the purpose that God has for you. Now, the money may not be coming in. So trust me, I understand about that kind of unemployment. Yeah, I get that. I get the stress of it. Somebody asked me, what's the worst job you ever had? I said, looking for a job. That's the worst job I've ever had. But while looking for a job, I was out in the street corner preaching. And so I still had something. And beyond just talking, there were still other people who, and so all the things that I had been doing when I was in full-time ministry and fully occupied and getting paid for it, I just kept doing those things. Not to pat Marcus on the back, but I learned that from somebody else. God did not open my mind and just say, Marcus, I want you to go street preach. No, I saw other people who did that and who made good use of their time while they didn't necessarily have anything to do. And there's certain things that came about. I had a buddy, I'm telling too many stories. I got to get y'all out of here. A buddy. He was an established preacher. He couldn't offer me a job, but they needed, like I'm bothering Eric about websites and whatnot. He's talking with me right now, putting up with all my pestering, because we get calls about, people who want to help, right? I put together, stumbling around with one friend who was in nonprofit, didn't want to believe in God, but we stayed connected because we had a common interest in helping people. So after they retired, they started a nonprofit. And I was struggling with the website builder. I couldn't make any sense of it. And they were like, oh, Marcus, why don't you try this one? I was like, okay, why not? And so then I found a website builder that I could actually use knowing nothing at all. And then I had a friend who needed a website for the congregation that they were working at. And I wasn't doing anything. So I was like, well, let me just try to put a couple of pages together. And that turned into a website. But at the end of the day, he didn't realize they already had somebody to design their website. Just the right hand wasn't telling the left hand what was going on. And so ultimately, I do all that work in vain, right? No. That ends up becoming another congregation's website. And that's a whole lot of work that I don't have to do. But all the while I'm doing work while I'm not getting paid, I don't realize how God, people say it all the time, older Christians will tell you, from the Bible, nothing that you're doing for him is wasted. And it's so easy for me to say that right now. But when I'm in those moments, I don't remember. But there are times when even if the money isn't coming in, if you just keep working, understanding that God has given you some kind of gift that can help somebody, sometimes God will be like, no, buddy, you're actually working for you. I just wanted to see if you would actually care enough about somebody else to help them out. So ultimately, my little preacher testimonies, I'm not one of them who's big. We don't come from testimony churches, right? This is my testimony, because they can get wild, can't they? But sometimes that's my testimony, because there are times when I've seen that happen. I told you, I am the little faith person. I'm not one who believes a whole lot. But as the little faith person, when I can tell you there are times that the only before and after in my change is something that God literally did, that's it. That's all I can tell you. Everything else is false, right? I hope I'm not stretching it into a fish story, but the fundamentals are still true. To the degree you're willing to work for people, whether or not you're being paid, you may find God repaying you through the very labor you have given to other people when you weren't charging for it. And so as we move on to Psalm 104 and Psalm 105 to close. Psalm 104, verse 9. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. We talked about that whole concept of boundaries and how in God we can understand healthy boundaries. One of the things that came from that story that also reminded me of this set of passages was when that guy, they started the story talking about his life kind of through his progression of finding religion, because he was a very religious guy. Through his first marriage and his second marriage. And his second marriage, after he kidnapped his kids from the first marriage and took them out near Tacoma, he ended up with a woman who said he was so religious that if I would say there in the Bible, hell or damn, he would slap me in front of kids, right? That's how he laid the hammer down over minor technical violations of Scripture. But understand, in situations where we are setting boundaries, see, I can get real fired up about the boundaries that I like. But what I fail to remember when I'm setting really rigid boundaries on other people is that that's the measure that God's going to use for me. And so while this guy's laying the hammer down on his wife, speaking hell or damn, this guy's planning to shoot it out with the law. What do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing? God doesn't need any other standard than the one you set up in your home to condemn you. And I started realizing in my own life, it's the same way. And so after I started stumbling across a few of my own boundaries that I had set up for people, ones that God helped me see I couldn't really live by myself, then I started to have a little bit of a change of heart. So I'm not preaching about the made-for-TV movie with the same kind of condemnation I would have if I hadn't been in some ways. And hit nobody like that, but I'm not condemning that. But if I hadn't overstepped the boundaries that I'd set for other people at times in my life, right? And so I realized I needed to rein it back in the same way that I was watching the tragedy of this family, where the only solution she really had was, she was the one who basically was able to save half of the kids, or out of 7, 5 of the kids, and get them away from the gentleman who was going to end up that way. But moving on to, as we finish in Psalm 105, going back to a point that we had looked at a little bit before. In Psalm 105, the last of this set of 7, he's going to say, getting around verse 7, He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Understand that in that whole concept of permanence, that's one that comes up over and over again in the Psalms. That goes back to where we began again. The whole advantage to having God as a counselor, having his wisdom poured into us, avoiding the temptation to water it down with the pieces of my wisdom, I think might make it just that much better, is he has a wisdom that is everlasting. And just like the previous set of Psalms, or a few Psalms back, they talk about seasons in life. We've talked about that. There are seasons in life where I am not anywhere near as fit to run up and down a basketball court as I used to. And so I'd fool myself if I didn't realize that the young people I hoop with are showing me a little bit of mercy. And just happy that I'm still able to play a little, right? And so that's what we call reasonable judgment, helping me to understand that a lot of my success has to deal with the mercy of the people around me. And so understand that to the degree I have my judgment, as I say, I use this term over and over again, sober judgment. It's not always about drinking. It's not about drugs. It's about me setting reasonable expectations when I'm on nothing whatsoever, because those are the most dangerous intoxicants. Over and over again, he's going to talk about the way in which what I believe the Bible talks about is the most commonly talked about intoxicant in the Bible. It's pride. It's pride. It's pride. And he talks about it's literally the thing, as magnificent as the enemy was before he fell, right? What got him? It was pride. And that's the intoxicant. He knows. He knows if it got me, oh, I got them all day. And so he just gives us a little bit of pride to keep us away from understanding the things that God is helping us understand would make our success eternal. And so the wisdom in having God's uncut wisdom is making sure that even though we might have a season of success doing it our way, the only way you can understand that that's really going to last, either here or in eternity, is to understand that the uncut wisdom from God, the Noah wisdom, the wisdom Noah listened to before he got into the vineyard, that's the one that's going to endure, right? And I use the examples from time to time. See, it's easy for me to get up here and pull up pictures of the Bernie Madoffs of the world. And if you lived through that period of time, you realize before Bernie Madoff fell, everybody was lining up to invest money with Bernie Madoff, right? Oh, but in history, right? Then you see how that season came to an end, right? We got, what was it, Bear Stearns? Before Bernie, there was Bear Stearns. Oh, man, if I could get some of those guys over Bear Stearns to show me how to make magic, the magic came to an end, right? See, but one of the tough parts about being a preacher or a Christian is you're going to talk to people, and for every Bear Stearns, they're going to have in their workplace 20 people who seem like they're getting away with it, and it don't matter. So what do you do then? Because it's not always a visible collapse. And one of the things we talked about in the short lessons is you don't always see the underlying cracks in what's going on before God makes a very public fall. And even more frightening, the Bible says he rebukes those that he actually. So the most frightening thing in the world is when I get stuck into a pattern where God no longer wants to talk to me. One of the folks, Mark mentioned it this morning in the young adults class. He pointed it out from when Saul raised up the witch of Endor. And our sister said, or answered the question, Mark was like, why do you think that God stopped talking to Saul? Our sister said, keep reading. It's because Saul stopped listening to God. And so the other frightening option in that is it's not so much that I'm having symptoms internally or in the home that are warning me to make a turn. It's when I'm not getting any symptoms at all, right? And so that's when it starts to become fatal. And so understand. One of the reasons why we talk about ambitions is ambitions aren't wrong. Ambitions are healthy. But our ambitions are at our most stable when we understand that God is providing us the kind of counsel that helps us understand. Unlike Marcus, 10 years down the road and whatever your guidance counselor is helping you to understand that you might want to do, you're actually still doing that because you considered God on the front end, which is an opportunity that we have now as we come together and stand and sing to whether or not you need to come to the front or just in your seat. Ask God to give you the wisdom to resist the temptation to water down his counsel with whatever the world is telling you is better. That's it. Sorry. I'm sorry.